Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Somi Sorang with our panel of foreign journalists. Thank you for being here.
Hello.
And we're joined by a new journalist today, Kim Jong-un. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And you've served many years as a correspondent in many countries, including Egypt, Iraq, and Sweden, right?
That's right. I got to South Korea about 2 years ago.
All right, thank you for joining us. Now, the diplomatic balance around the Korean Peninsula is starting to shift following the North Korea-U.S. summit. And at this point, which of the regional powers do you think is the most invested in normalizing, in making greater ties with North Korea?
Well, I mean, recently we've seen the third meeting of Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping, and that was quite astonishing for me because usually North Korean state media is very careful in reporting about it, and this time they were already reporting about it while the event was still going on.
경의하는 최고령도자 동지께서는 스꾼평 동지와 뜨겁게 손을 마주 잡으시고 기념사진을 찍으셨습니다.
That reveals a great deal that China is definitely invested in, keeping things in control.
I agree. I think China is the country that has invested most in that. There were 3 summits. There were a lot of North Korean officials visiting China during this period of time, so which means there is some really great planning going on there.
Right. And Kim, do you have a different opinion?
No, I think I would agree about China. I think that it has a lot at stake. You know, China, of course, sees North Korea as a buffer between itself and a U.S. allied South Korea. With South Korea having about 29,000 troops on the peninsula, China definitely is vested in keeping North Korea stable.
Right.
But I would also say, that obviously a lot of countries are seeing the geopolitical situation shift.
Right.
So you have Japan is also trying to get into the game. And obviously Russia also sees an opportunity. Sergei Lavrov went to North Korea before the U.S. summit and with North Korea. And President Trump said he was not very happy about that. So I think that we're definitely seeing people vying for influence here.
Right. Okay. All right, this week on Foreign Correspondents, we'll delve into the flurry of diplomacy following the recent Pyongyang-Washington summit. Following the North Korea-U.S. summit, the regional powers around the Korean Peninsula are busy lining up their next moves. North Korea's pledge to denuclearize and develop its economy has completely altered the political and security landscape in Northeast Asia. The regional powers are moving quickly to plot their next diplomatic course of action to avoid being left behind. Washington is deliberating over its follow-up measures in the aftermath of the North Korea-U.S. summit in order to stay firmly in the driver's seat.
A lot of work between here and there. My team is already doing it. I'll likely travel back before too terribly long.
Even Japan, which has long advocated a hardline policy against North Korea, is working to smoothen its relations with Pyongyang. China, as North Korea's long-standing traditional ally, is also wielding a lot of influence on the developments surrounding the Korean Peninsula. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un traveled to China once again on June 19th, his third visit to the country this year alone, following one in March and one in May. Meanwhile, Russia, which has marked the 70th anniversary since establishing diplomatic ties with North Korea, is also working to arrange a summit with Pyongyang. President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly asked Kim Jong-un to visit Russia in September for the Eastern Economic Forum. Possibilities of Putin's visit to North Korea is also being raised. North Korea's Kim Yong-nam, the vice chairman of the Workers' Party Central Committee, visited Russia for the opening ceremony of the 2018 World Cup, where he delivered a personal letter from Kim Jong-un to President Vladimir Putin. In the midst of this diplomatic tug-of-war, it remains to be seen how they will reshape the foreign relations environment surrounding the Korean Peninsula. Okay, so Kim, what kind of stories have you covered?
So I've been very focused on the U.S. and South Korea's decision to suspend the military exercises,
Right.
which of course is turning out to be, sort of a keystone in the diplomacy right now. Obviously, that's seen as a major concession by many to the North.
Right.
And so, of course, we're all looking for the next steps. What is North Korea going to do? What is it going to agree to? Looking at, the U.S. Secretary of State is getting ready, reportedly, to go back to Pyongyang.
Right.
So those kind of stories.
Right. And I also heard that you actually covered the Pyongyang-Washington summit in Singapore on ground. So how was that?
I did. It was very crazy, very chaotic.
Hectic, I would
obviously.
imagine.
Two very unpredictable leaders, and they lived up to their unpredictability, for sure. But it was very exciting to be there. There were thousands of journalists from all over the world.
Right. Okay. Now let's talk about Japan and North Korea relations. So Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has changed his tune somewhat and said that he would like to establish better ties with North Korea, one that's based on trust. Do you think Pyongyang is, to say, on the same wavelength about this?
I mean, there are of course lots of historic, issues that have to be solved first, and we'll want some concessions concerning the abductions issue. But I mean, on a side note, what I recently heard, I have a friend who's a movie director, a South Korean movie director, who's been living in Germany for over 30 years, and she recently did a documentary about North Korea. Surprisingly, this film was released now in Japan, and they planned it as a very niche documentary, and now they release it in over 20 cities, and that was kind of telling for me, because obviously the interest in North Korea is increasing in Japan too, and I think this perception or shift in public opinion is through cultural things is important also in establishing the Japan and North Korea diplomatic ties, because what Abe does, it also has to be backed by the population.
Right. Okay, and Kim?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, there's a painful history between Japan and North Korea and South Korea as well. But, there's a painful history between North Korea and the United States, and they seem to be moving forward with diplomacy. I think that all the leaders of these countries are showing a lot of pragmatism right now. And I think that Japan will hold firm on the abductions issue.
Right.
And that's potentially something where North Korea could give. I think it was Kim Jong-il, when they were having talks in the early 2000s, that's when he admitted to having abducted to about a dozen Japanese, and they did let some of the Japanese go home at that time. So I think that I would look for that as kind of a concrete gesture.
Right.
But we'll see if they actually agree to a summit.
Right.
That'll be telling.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, he reportedly sent a birthday card, a congratulatory message, and a present to Xi Jinping for his birthday. How do you think the Pyongyang-Washington summit affected Pyongyang-Beijing relations?
Well, first we should note that it was the first time, I think, since 2013 that he sent this congratulation letter, so it's meaningful. I think China is very sensitive of not being left out in that process. The approachment of Kim and Trump gave China an incentive to get back on the boat and pull the strings from the background, I think.
Right. And Kim?
Yeah, I agree. I think that where we're going to see the relationship having the most tangible effect may be in the loosening of sanctions. China's implementation of sanctions under pressure from the United States was, many argue, pivotal in North Korea agreeing to come to the table.
Right.
There were other reasons, of course. But I think that now that we see the relationship between China and North Korea improving, that could be kind of a tangible benefit for the North.
Right.
And of course, that may make it more difficult if the United States ever wanted to go back to its so-called maximum pressure campaign.
Right. How do you foresee the economic relationship between Pyongyang and Beijing?
Well, we already can see some of the movements towards easing of pressure. Just recently, there were news reports that Chinese tourist companies have restarted tours to North Korea. And obviously, if the detente continues, if the situation goes on with the dialogue, then China is willing to lift the sanctions, and it will be lifting it slowly, gradually.
Right. And do you think that China will continue to play the so-called big brother role with North Korea?
I mean, I think there are two aspects to it. First, from the North Korean side, I think they would be smart in not only relying on China, like economically, because if they have too much power over North Korea, that can be dangerous for the regime as well. And on the other hand, concerning a big brother, politically, China can teach North Korea quite something. For example, the capitalism with Chinese characteristics. I mean, this kind of model of opening the economy, but still holding firm control and have a one-party system that could be interesting for North Korea. But of course, North Korea is very careful with words like, capitalism or market reform. They wouldn't call it that way. But who knows? Maybe Kim Jong-un is trying to pursue that. And recently, one lawmaker in Korea said that during the Inter-Korean summit, Kim Jong-un told them that Kim Yong-chol, the old party member, was actually holding him back in pursuing change. So it was Kim Jong-un was actually more willing to change the society than he could on his own.
Right.
I cannot confirm it, but that would be interesting.
Now, you mentioned just then that it's probably not the smartest thing for North Korea to just have ties with China economically and otherwise. What other country then might they consider approaching?
Well, I think they should have a mix. I mean, U.S. said that it's not up to them to, help North Korea economically, but just in the region, South Korea is a big player. Of course, we will see that. We already saw that the companies, I think it was mostly middle-sized companies who were asking to send 100,000 North Korean workers to the south and get some 4-year work visas and get some training here. Then Japan has the money to invest in North Korea, who knows? And Russia, I think, they could supply North Korea with energy and oil, all that. So the structure is there, yeah.
Right.
There were a lot of North Korean workers in the Russian Far East just before the sanctions were implemented. More than 20 or 30,000 people coming to Russia to work as the construction workers and agricultural workers. So I think that Russia would also, after the lifting of the sanctions, it would once again attract this.
Okay. All right, we've discussed North Korea's diplomacy with the regional powers. Now let's move down south to South Korea. What kind of diplomatic action are we seeing from President Moon Jae-in? Let's take a look. South Korea, which played an important mediating role for the North Korea-U.S. summit, is beginning to step up its diplomatic game with the 4 regional powers. Just 2 days following the summit on June 14th, the foreign ministers of South Korea, the U.S. and Japan gathered for a high-level meeting in Seoul. The top diplomats from the 3 countries reaffirmed their commitment to ensure peace on the Korean Peninsula and cooperate on North Korea's denuclearization.
During the meeting today, Secretary Pompeo briefed us on the outcome of the June 12th U.S. DPRK summit. I congratulated him and President Trump for the success of the summit, which will be recorded as a historic turning point towards completely ridding the Korean Peninsula of the last remnant of the Korean War, resolving the North Korean nuclear issue, and securing permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula.
We believe that Chairman Kim Jong-un understands the urgency of the timing of completing this denuclearization, that he understands that we must do this quickly. And I know each of the 3 of us leaders here today are tasked with making sure that we implement that in a way that is as quick and as complete as we can achieve over the coming days and weeks.
We understand that the United States will advance the discussion on provision of security guarantees while carefully monitoring whether North Korea takes concrete steps to fulfill its commitment to denuclearization.
After the meeting, Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo held separate talks over the phone where they reaffirmed the South Korea-U.S. military alliance. Meanwhile, South Korean President Moon Jae-in embarked on a trip to Russia on June 21st for a 2-night, 4-day visit, his 3rd meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. During the summit, President Moon asked his Russian counterpart for his assistance in Pyongyang's denuclearization process.
나는 한반도와 유라시아의 항구적인 평화와 공동 번영을 꿈꿔왔습니다. 이 자리에 계신 원 여러분들께서도 그 길에 함께 해주실 것으로 믿습니다. 한반도의 평화 체제가 구축되면 남북 경제 협력이 본격화 될 것이며 러시아와의 삼각 협력으로 확대될 것입니다.
He also requested Moscow's cooperation in establishing a framework of peace to end the Cold War confrontation in Northeast Asia. All the while, South Korea, China, and Japan could hold yet another trilateral summit in the near future. The 2018 South Korea-China-Japan summit was already held back in May, and it's highly unusual for such a meeting to occur twice in the same calendar year. According to media reports, China may be trying to bolster its influence on the Korean Peninsula by reaching out to South Korea and Japan to avoid being left out. The South Korean government still has a lot of work remaining on its hands to forge closer cooperation with the regional powers that wield significant influence on the Korean Peninsula. The South Korea-Russia summit was held on June 21st, making President Moon Jae-in the first South Korean leader to go on a state visit to Russia in 19 years. So why might have Putin invited President Moon Jae-in?
I think the first thing is the economics. That's the most important thing. Russian economy is now under pressure from the West, and the government is looking for ways to attract investment from other sides, from the East.
Right.
It could bring development and investment into the Russian Far East, and also the Trilateral cooperation involving South Korea and North Korea.
Okay.
Also, I did an interview with President Moon Jae-in just a few days before, and he also mentioned that Russia and South Korea apparently are going to discuss the North Korean nuclear issue and talk about the further denuclearization. And he was talking about also maybe establishing some multilateral mechanism for peace and security in the East Asia. That is also an important thing.
I agree. I think that, there's a lot going on. Economics are certainly at the forefront for all the parties. I think that President Moon also knows that Russia could be a troublemaker. It can either, help in this process or it can hurt in this process, and that's very clear. I think President Trump knows this as well. There are reports that he's considering a summit with President Putin. So it'll be interesting going forward. Russia holds veto power in the UN Security Council. So any move to lift sanctions or maintain and impose further sanctions, Russia would have a say in that.
Right.
But if you watch old interviews of Putin, let's say going back to January or last year, he predicted many things what are happening actually right now, and he's been very consistent in insisting that the denuclearization issue can only be solved by talks, by communication, by negotiation. So I think he has this mediating role. And I'm also wondering, I'm not an expert to answer this, but do the historic ties between the Soviet Union and North Korea, former Soviet Union and North Korea, still play a role, or is it something of the past? I mean, North Korea was basically how do you call this, founded under the patronage of the Soviet Union, right?
Well, this is judging from the trade volume. Russia doesn't really play a big part in North Korean economy, but we certainly do have many cultural exchanges with North Korea, and the Russian cultural influence in the north is quite big. Every year there are famous Russian bands coming there. They're giving concerts like the Bolshoi Theater or Alexander Chorus and military bands, etc. Besides, when Kim Jong-un, he was a very good friend with the Russian ambassador. They met each other more than 40 times, actually, and that also influenced that. As far as I know, that at that time, Kim Jong-il would say to the ambassador, it's a shame that we do not have a bigger economic cooperation, but obviously it was not really possible at that time. But maybe it will change with the trilateral projects now.
Okay. Now, according to Japanese media outlets, China proposed a trilateral summit, so China, Japan, and South Korea, sometime during December, which would mark the second such summit in the space of a calendar year. Why do you think China is eager for a trilateral summit so soon?
Well, many aspects to it. At first, I mean, those are the powers here in the region, so it makes sense, and I think they should cooperate on many important issues, not only about North Korea. I mean, we talked about the historic issues that they have and the huge potential that is wasted actually because of those historic problems that are not solved. And so I think it makes sense to have a trilateral summit. And I think one motivating factor is also for China to, keep the region together and not lose leverage lose leverage to Trump, I guess.
Yeah, I think that we're seeing a struggle for the balance of power in this region. The U.S. is definitely looking to counter the Chinese influence. They're engaged. They're on the verge of a trade war with the United States. This is backed up recently. The U.S. renamed its regional military command the Indo-Pacific Command instead of the Pacific Command. India has also stepped into this in terms of balancing against Japan as a regional power.
Right. Now, one media outlet reported that it was President Xi Jinping who suggested to Kim Jong-un to bring up the issue of suspending the joint South Korea-U.S. military drills. Meanwhile, Trump claims that it was his idea and his alone. Whose side is telling the truth, do you think, and does it really matter?
That's exactly the point. No, it doesn't really matter because the stance of the Chinese government was clear before. They suggested that freeze for freeze deals, so it was clear that what they wanted. And we know that Trump is very flexible when it comes to telling the truth, but I would give him the benefit of the doubt. Probably he brought it up, and to be honest, it doesn't really matter who said that. Yeah.
If they would ask Kim Jong-un, I guess he would say that it was his idea, because North Korea has been demanding the suspension of the military drills for a long time, since they were started, I guess, 70 years ago.
So going away from whose idea it was, what's your opinion on the suspension of the drills?
I think that, they've only announced the suspension of one of the exercises. It is a major exercise. This is one of two major exercises. However, the Americans and the South Koreans train together constantly in smaller scale drills, daily training, and they have not announced, whether they will continue the suspension of the drills. So this is something that, could be lifted. They could change their mind. They could announce that they're going forward with the next exercises.
Okay, now this next question goes along with what you were alluding to before. Do you think we are on the verge of shifting away from the Cold War confrontation between South Korea, U.S., Japan, and China, Russia, and North Korea?
I wouldn't say we're on the verge. We're just in the beginning of this process. And I think we'll see the first results after President Trump finishes his office, because many critics say that North Korea just is trying to buy time and wait for when he leaves the office, and then the new president comes who doesn't care about North Korea. It might be so, but I personally think that Kim Jong-un is quite sincere in his moves. And anyway, we'll see that in 2 years.
Okay. All right, guys, do you have any final comments?
Well, right now there are really exciting times, and I'm looking forward to what happens next, and particularly to the family reunions that will become possible. They seem so close, so I really hope to cover that and follow that story.
Okay, instead?
Yeah, there are many exciting changes going on now. I'm also looking forward to see what would be the next step. I'm also waiting for the new summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un that is supposedly planned for September. It would be interesting what they would talk about.
Okay, and Kim?
Yeah, I think if nothing else, this process, although very much at the beginning, has tamped down the tensions from last year. And so it will be interesting to see what the next steps are and how far North Korea is willing to go.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for joining me and sharing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
There has been a flurry of diplomacy in the aftermath of the Pyongyang-Washington summit, and it's our hope that such efforts will soon lead to peace and prosperity for both the regional powers and the world at large. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.